Alice, a 15-year-old teenager, lived in a small town in the northern region of Brazil called São Gabriel da Floresta. The town was surrounded by dense forests and rushing rivers, a paradise for many, but not for Alice. She preferred the virtual corners of the internet to the natural beauty that surrounded her. Since childhood, Alice had an affinity for technology. With the popularization of social media, she became an avid user, creating profiles on all possible platforms. Her social networks were her sanctuary, where she could be whoever she wanted, away from the critical and judgmental eyes of the real world. Alice woke up early every morning, but her first act of the day was always the same: to grab her cell phone and check her notifications, likes, comments, messages. All of this was vital to her. Even before getting out of bed, she was already immersed in the virtual world. At school, Alice was not popular, but she was not completely invisible either. She maintained a discreet presence, interacting only when necessary. Her classmates saw her as a reserved girl, always with her cell phone in hand and headphones on. The classes were bearable only because she knew that during the breaks, she could return to her digital world. At home, the situation was not much different. Marta, her mother, noticed with concern how much Alice was isolating herself. Marta was a teacher at the local school, a caring and dedicated woman who always tried to get close to her daughter. However, her attempts usually resulted in arguments or awkward silences. Carlos, her father, was a civil engineer and spent a lot of time away, working on projects in the region. He loved his family, but had difficulty expressing his feelings, especially when it came to Alice. Alice's routine was a constant search for online validation. She spent hours browsing forums, watching videos, and playing multiplayer games. Her room was her refuge, decorated with posters of her favorite games and lit only by the light of the monitor. Family meals were tense moments. Marta always tried to start conversations, asking about Alice's day or suggesting activities they could do together, but Alice's answers were monosyllabic. Carlos tried to mediate, but usually felt helpless in the face of the growing distance between him and his daughter. On weekends, while other teenagers in town went out to parties or gatherings, Alice remained locked in her room. She claimed that she preferred the company of her virtual friends, people who, according to her, understood her better than anyone at school or at home. This disconnection from reality became more and more pronounced over the years, leaving Alice increasingly immersed in a world of bits and pixels. The turning point came when she discovered a game that would change her life forever. A game that would lead her down a dark and dangerous path, from which there seemed to be no return. It was a rainy afternoon in São Gabriel da Floresta, and Alice was once again locked in her room. Browsing through obscure internet forums, she came across a topic that caught her attention. The game of death. Do you have the courage? Curious, Alice clicked on the link and was redirected to a mysterious website. The dark colors and the somber music that played in the background created an unsettling yet fascinating atmosphere. The game promised a unique experience, based on personal choices and real consequences. The central theme involved young people dealing with depression, self-harm, and eventually suicide. Alice, feeling lost and misunderstood in the real world, was drawn to the promise of a place where her dark emotions could be understood and even validated. She downloaded the game, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. It's just a game, she thought. Nothing that can really affect me. The game's name was Shadows of the Soul, and its interface was simple, but loaded with symbolism and disturbing images. That night, Alice threw herself headfirst into Shadows of the Soul. The game began with the creation of an avatar, a young person with the ability to be customized in detail, allowing Alice to project her own characteristics onto them. She chose a character that reflected her emotional state: dark hair, sad eyes, and clothes that conveyed a sense of despair. The first missions were simple, focused on exploring a dark urban environment, full of dark alleys and abandoned buildings. The game encouraged her to interact with other characters, each with a story of pain and suffering. Alice found it fascinating how the game captured the nuances of depression, something she felt but could never express in words. As she progressed, Alice found herself increasingly involved in the narrative. She spent hours exploring, making choices, and seeing how her decisions affected the course of the game. One of the first significant missions involved helping a secondary character, Maria, who was dealing with suicidal thoughts. Alice felt a strange sense of connection with Maria, and the mission to save her left her emotionally involved. Alice didn't realize how much time was passing while she was playing. The game had a way of keeping her attention, offering small challenges and emotional rewards that made her feel accomplished. Every time she completed a mission, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction, as if she was helping herself in some way. Over the following weeks, the game became an essential part of Alice's routine. She could hardly wait to get home from school and continue her journey in Shadows of the Soul. The depressive atmosphere and the dark themes, which had initially scared her, now seemed familiar and comforting. The game understood her in a way that no one else seemed to be able to. Alice began to share her discoveries with some of her virtual friends, but most of them were not interested. They found the game too heavy, preferring lighter and more relaxed activities. This made Alice feel even more special and unique for being able to understand and appreciate Shadows of the Soul. As Alice delved deeper into the game, the lines between reality and the virtual world began to blur. She still thought she was in control, that it was just a harmless game. But the truth was that Shadows of the Soul was starting to penetrate her mind and influence her thoughts and emotions in ways she could not foresee. In the beginning, Shadows of the Soul was just a form of escape for Alice. She played for a few hours each night, balancing her school responsibilities and family expectations. But as the game's narrative deepened and became more complex, so did Alice's need to keep playing. The nights turned into sleepless dawns. Alice lost track of time, her hands firmly gripping the mouse and keyboard while her eyes fixed on the monitor absorbed every dark detail of the game. Her mind was constantly focused on the next challenge, the next mission, the next decision that could change the course of the story. At school, her grades began to fall. Alice couldn't concentrate in class and often fell asleep over her books. Teachers expressed concern, but she minimized the problems, claiming to be just tired. The time she once devoted to studying and housework was now consumed by the game. Weekends, which could once have been an opportunity to relax and socialize, became gaming marathons. Marta and Carlos noticed the change, but were unsure of how to handle it. Marta tried to set limits, but Alice always found a way to bend the rules, waiting for her parents to fall asleep to resume the game. The depressive atmosphere of Shadows of the Soul began to infiltrate Alice's life in subtle ways. At first, it was just a sense of melancholy that followed her even when she wasn't playing. She found herself reliving moments from the game, the dialogues laden with sadness and despair echoing in her mind. Gradually, this melancholy evolved into something deeper. Alice felt a constant sense of fatigue and discouragement. The things that once brought her joy, like watching funny videos or talking to her virtual friends, lost their charm. She felt apathetic, as if an invisible shadow was taking over her life. Her appearance began to reflect her emotional state. Alice stopped worrying about her hygiene and how she dressed. The dark circles under her eyes became more pronounced, her skin pale and lifeless. Her parents tried to encourage her to leave the house, to do activities she enjoyed, but Alice simply didn't have the energy or will. Marta, seeing her daughter increasingly distant, tried to talk to Alice countless times. She asked about school, her friends, her feelings. But Alice just shut down, offering monosyllabic answers or pretending she was fine. Marta considered seeking professional help, but Alice resisted, insisting that everything was under control. Carlos, on the other hand, dealt with the situation in a practical way. He believed it was just a phase, something Alice would overcome in time. However, even he couldn't ignore the visible changes in his daughter. Arguments between the parents became frequent, each trying to decide the best way to help Alice, but to no avail. As the days went by, Alice's depression intensified. She began to isolate herself even more, shutting herself up in her room for long periods, often without eating or sleeping properly. The game, which had once seemed like a harmless distraction, now dominated her life. Alice didn't play just for fun. She played because she needed to, as if the game was her only source of meaning and purpose. The characters in Shadows of the Soul, with their tragic stories and grim endings, became the only company Alice tolerated. She saw herself reflected in their struggles and pain, feeling a deep connection to their experiences of despair. The line between reality and the game continued to blur, and Alice began to feel that her own life was destined for a similar path of darkness. Marta and Carlos' efforts to reach out to Alice became more desperate, but with each frustrated attempt, the family fragmented a little more. Alice was trapped in a vicious cycle of addiction and depression, a cycle that no one seemed able to break. Alice's nights, once dedicated to the game Shadows of the Soul, began to transform into a true psychological battlefield. Dreams, once an escape from reality, became terrifying extensions of the game. Every time Alice closed her eyes, she was transported to the game's dark and oppressive settings, but now everything seemed much more real. In one of these nightmares, Alice found herself wandering down a narrow, dimly lit corridor, the walls covered with graffiti that told stories of pain and suffering. She heard whispers that grew louder with each step, voices of young people who had succumbed to depression. The game's spirit, a slender figure with empty eyes and a sinister smile, appeared frequently, laughing at her anguish and whispering words of despair. On another night, Alice dreamed that she was trapped in an abandoned building, surrounded by shadowy figures that moved in the darkness. She tried to find a way out, but every door she opened led her back to the starting point. The spirit followed her, whispering that there was no escape, that her fate was sealed. Alice woke up sweating cold, her heart pounding, but the feeling of dread persisted even after she opened her eyes. These vivid and terrifying dreams began to affect her mental and physical state. Alice was afraid to sleep, knowing that the nightmares awaited her. Her health deteriorated rapidly, her sunken and tired eyes reflecting the sleepless nights. Marta and Carlos tried to intervene, but Alice was increasingly withdrawn into her own world of fear and despair. It was during this tumultuous period that a new student arrived at Alice's school. Clara was different from the others. She had a serene air and a comforting presence, as if she carried with her an ancient wisdom. Clara quickly stood out for her ability to feel and perceive things that others could not. From the first encounter, Clara felt something strange around Alice. It was a sense of unease, a dark presence that seemed to follow the girl wherever she went. Clara, being sensitive, knew that she could not ignore what she was perceiving. She approached Alice, offering friendship in a subtle and genuine way. Alice, despite her seclusion, felt curiously drawn to Clara. There was something comforting about her presence, something Alice hadn't felt in a long time. They began to spend more time together, and Clara slowly gained Alice's trust. One afternoon, while walking together through the schoolyard, Clara decided to share her concerns. "Alice, I know it may seem strange, but since I arrived, I've been feeling something around you. It's like there's a presence, something that shouldn't be here." Alice looked at Clara, surprised and skeptical. "Presence? What are you talking about?" Clara hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I have a sensitivity for these things. I feel energies, presences, and the one I feel near you is very strong and disturbing." Alice gave a nervous laugh. "Are you saying I have a ghost haunting me? That's ridiculous." "I know it sounds ridiculous, but it's real. Please just be careful. Try to pay attention to your dreams, to the sensations you have when you're alone. If you need help, I'll be here." Alice shook her head in disbelief. "It's just nightmares, something in my head. It's nothing." Clara knew she couldn't force Alice to believe, but she felt a growing responsibility. She promised herself that she would keep an eye on Alice, ready to help when needed. Meanwhile, Alice continued to fight the demons that haunted her, increasingly immersed in a world where the line between reality and imagination became increasingly blurred. About a month after Clara tried to alert Alice to the dark presence around her, a subtle but disturbing change began to occur. People who approached Alice felt a slight discomfort, an indescribable feeling that something was wrong. This feeling was not easily identifiable: a slight tightness in the chest, a chill down the spine, or an inexplicable feeling of sadness that passed quickly, but left a trail of unease. Alice's classmates began to keep their distance, commenting among themselves about how different she seemed. Even the teachers noticed the change in the atmosphere when Alice was present, but did not know how to address the issue. Marta and Carlos, her parents, felt this same sensation at home. The mood was heavy, and communication with Alice seemed increasingly difficult. Clara, on the other hand, knew exactly what was happening. Her training as a sensitive had prepared her to recognize these signs. The presence around Alice was growing stronger, feeding on the negative energy that the girl emitted. Clara became increasingly concerned, especially because she had seen something similar before. Determined to help Alice in any way possible, Clara decided to share a personal story, hoping that it would make her friend understand the seriousness of the situation. One late afternoon, as they walked through a park near the school, Clara began to speak. "Alice, I want to tell you a story. A few years ago, I met a girl named Julia. She was a lot like you, reserved, intelligent, but deeply sad. Julia also isolated herself from the world and, over time, began to attract a very negative presence." Alice looked at Clara, curious but still skeptical. "What happened to her?" "Julia began to experience the same symptoms as you. Terrible nightmares, constant fatigue, and everyone around her felt an inexplicable discomfort. I felt the presence of a spirit near her, a spirit that fed on her depressive energy. He was sucking her vitality, leaving her weaker every day." "Is this real, Clara? Isn't it just in your head?" Alice asked, her voice revealing a mixture of fear and disbelief. "I know it sounds surreal, Alice, but it's real. The negative energy you're feeling, and that others around you are feeling too, isn't just a coincidence." In Julia's case, the situation got worse because no one believed her until it was too late. She ended up in the hospital, and even then, the spirit continued to haunt her. Alice felt a chill run down her spine. "And what happened to her?" "Julia ended up in a coma, just like you fear in your worst nightmares. It was only after a long time and a lot of spiritual help that we were able to ward off the spirit, but Julia was never the same again. I believe that if we had acted sooner, we could have helped more." Clara looked deeply into Alice's eyes, her voice full of determination. "I don't want you to go through the same thing. I know it's hard to believe something you can't see, but please try to trust me. We need to find a way to ward off this presence before it's too late." Alice fell silent, absorbing every word. For the first time, she began to consider the possibility that Clara might be right. The constant discomfort, the nightmares, the feeling of being followed. It all seemed to fit Clara's narrative. Although she was still scared and skeptical, Alice knew she couldn't ignore the signs any longer. From that moment on, Clara became not only a friend, but an indispensable ally in the fight against the dark presence that threatened to consume Alice. Together, they would begin to seek answers and solutions, facing the unknown and defying the terror that lurked in the shadows of Alice's soul. Alice's nights were becoming a true torment. Every time she closed her eyes, she was transported into an endless nightmare, where the dark spirit of the game's shadows of the soul awaited her. At first, the spirit appeared only as an indistinct figure in the shadows, but as time went by, its presence became increasingly clear and frightening. In one of the nightmares, Alice found herself in a dark room, the walls covered with disturbing inscriptions. She felt a presence behind her, and when she turned around, she found the spirit. It was a tall, skeletal figure with empty eyes and a macabre smile that didn't look human. He approached slowly, whispering words of despair and loneliness that echoed in her mind even after she woke up. Each night, the visions of the spirit became more intense. In a particularly vivid dream, Alice was trapped in a dark forest, with no way out. The spirit pursued her, its movements swift and erratic, as if it were feeding on her fear. She woke up screaming, sweating cold, and with a sense of panic that she couldn't shake off. Sleep deprivation and constant anxiety began to take a visible toll on Alice's physical health. Her parents, Marta and Carlos, watched with growing concern as their daughter transformed before their eyes. Her skin, once healthy, was now pale and lifeless. The dark circles under her eyes were deep, a reflection of her sleepless nights. Alice was weaker than ever. She moved slowly, as if each step required tremendous effort. She could barely eat, and when she tried, the food seemed tasteless, as if her life had been drained of any pleasure or comfort. Her mental health was in tatters, and the physical impact was undeniable. At school, Alice struggled to keep her eyes open during class. Her mind was foggy and confused. The teachers and classmates became distant figures, irrelevant in the face of her personal torment. Clara, always close by, watched her friend with growing anguish, knowing that time was running out. Marta and Carlos tried to intervene, but Alice was in a state of desperate denial. Every attempt to talk, every effort to take her to the doctor, was met with resistance and tears. Alice knew that something was very wrong, but the constant presence of the spirit and the fear of being considered crazy prevented her from seeking help. The situation reached a critical point when, on a weekend, Alice fainted in the kitchen. Marta found her on the floor, pale and motionless. Panic gripped the house as Carlos called emergency services. At the hospital, the doctors confirmed what Marta and Carlos feared. Alice was physically and mentally exhausted. Sleep deprivation, poor nutrition, and constant stress had pushed her body to the limit. Alice was admitted for observation, but even in the safe environment of the hospital, the spirit did not leave her in peace. She saw the skeletal figure in the corners of the room, felt its presence at night. The only person who seemed to understand was Clara, who visited Alice whenever she could, bringing with her a sense of calm and security that no one else could provide. Clara knew she had to act quickly. Julia's story was repeating itself before her eyes, and she couldn't let Alice succumb to the same fate. Gathering all the courage and knowledge she possessed, Clara decided it was time to confront the spirit directly, determined to save her friend from the terror that consumed her. Alice's situation had reached a critical point. Marta and Carlos, desperate and with no other options, decided that the only way to help their daughter was to admit her to a psychiatric clinic. The process was painful for everyone. Alice resisted with all her might, screaming and crying as she was taken to the clinic. The feeling of betrayal and despair overwhelmed her. She felt completely alone, not understanding that this was her family's last attempt to save her. The clinic was a cold and impersonal place, with white walls and full of security cameras, conveying an air of sterility. Alice was placed in a small room with only a bed and a table. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional sound of nurses and doctors walking down the corridors. The first days at the clinic were a nightmare. Alice felt like a prisoner, constantly watched and deprived of any freedom. Despair and revolt grew within her, fueled by the feeling of abandonment. The spirit, which had previously only appeared in dreams, now became a constant presence, visible only to her. The spirit took advantage of Alice's vulnerability to manifest itself more intensely. It would appear in the dark corners of the room, its empty eyes fixed on her, a cruel smile distorting its face. Alice tried to ignore it, but the presence was overwhelming. The spirit began to whisper in her ear, words of despair and hatred that echoed in her mind. "You're alone, Alice. No one can help you. Your family has abandoned you. You'll never get out of here." These words penetrated deep into Alice's mind, eroding any shred of hope she might have had. The skeletal figure followed her through the corridors, appearing in window and mirror reflections, always lurking. The doctors and nurses couldn't see the spirit, and any attempt by Alice to explain what was happening was met with concerned looks and increased doses of medication. The constant presence of the spirit and the feeling of despair increased Alice's revolt and fear. She felt imprisoned not only by the clinic but also by this evil entity that seemed to feed on her suffering. Increasingly isolated and desperate, Alice began to listen to the spirit's whispers more closely. One night, the spirit intensified its influence. Alice was lying in bed trying to sleep when the spirit appeared beside her, more real and palpable than ever. His voice, now clear and persuasive, urged her to escape. "You don't belong here, Alice. You need to get out of here. They're locking you up, but you can be free. I can help you." Alice's mind was clouded and confused by the medication, but the spirit's words made sense in her anguish. In a state of semi-consciousness, she got out of bed and, guided by the spirit, began to plan her escape. The spirit seemed to know every corner of the clinic, every escape route, and guided Alice with precision. On a cold dawn, Alice found an unlocked window and escaped from the clinic, feeling the fresh night air for the first time in weeks. She ran without looking back, driven by panic and the incessant voice of the spirit that guided her. The nearby forest was dense and dark, but Alice didn't hesitate. She plunged into the woods, with the spirit following closely behind, whispering instructions and words of encouragement. "Keep going, Alice. You're almost there. Freedom is ahead of you." The darkness of the forest was oppressive, the branches and roots seeming to try to hold her back at every step. Alice was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but she kept running, pushed by desperation and the constant presence of the spirit. The uneven terrain and lack of light made the escape increasingly dangerous. Within the forest, the spirit began to become more verbally aggressive. He laughed at Alice's weakness, mocking her efforts. "You're pathetic, Alice. You'll never find peace. You belong to me." The cruel words and the relentless pursuit of the spirit began to erode Alice's sanity. She stumbled and fell, scratching herself on branches and stones, but she kept getting up, determined to escape that torment. The spirit was always there by her side, intensifying her fear and anguish. After 2 weeks missing in the forest, Alice was found by a group of hikers. She was in a deplorable state, malnourished, dehydrated, and in a coma. Her rescuers immediately took her to the hospital, where doctors began to treat her numerous wounds and severe malnutrition. In the hospital, Marta and Carlos, consumed by guilt and despair, waited by Alice's bedside. Clara was also there, her expression reflecting the pain and helplessness she felt. Everyone wondered if they could have done more. After 2 weeks missing in the dense forest, Alice was found by a group of hikers. She was in a coma, her frail and wounded body a testament to the hardships she had endured. The hikers immediately called for help, and Alice was rushed to the nearest hospital. At the hospital, the doctors did everything they could to stabilize Alice. She remained unconscious, trapped in a state between life and death, while her body struggled to recover from the physical and emotional trauma she had suffered. In the silence of the hospital waiting room, Clara sat, staring into space. Her thoughts were deep in a sea of reflections and unanswered questions. She blamed herself deeply for not being able to help Alice before it was too late. Every ignored conversation, every frustrated attempt to convince her of the real danger she faced, haunted Clara. Looking back, Clara realized that perhaps she had underestimated the seriousness of the situation. She had tried to warn Alice, but she hadn't been strong enough. Maybe if she had been more insistent, if she had sought help from adults sooner, things could have been different. But now, in the hospital, while Alice fought for her life, everything seemed too late. Clara felt a pang in her heart as she realized how important it was to trust parents and open up to them in the face of problems. Marta and Carlos, even though they didn't fully understand what was happening to Alice, had tried to protect her the best they could. Clara understood now that, oftentimes, adults might not fully understand what young people are going through, but they are always there to help if they are informed. The story ends with Alice still in a coma, her future uncertain. The presence of the spirit, though it seemed to have disappeared after her rescue, left deep marks on everyone involved. Marta and Carlos remained by their daughter's side, hoping for a miracle that could bring Alice back to them. For Clara, the experience had brought a painful understanding of the fragility of life and the importance of acting with determination in the face of adversity. She promised herself never again to underestimate the power of the unknown and the strength of family ties. As the sun slowly set beyond the hospital windows, a silence laden with hope and fear hung over everyone. The story of Alice and the impact of the spirit that haunted her would continue to echo in the minds of those who witnessed her suffering, leaving a sense of uncertainty and a grim reminder of the dangers that can lurk in the shadows of the human soul.